And we think that most of this decline is uniform and it happens late in life. That's not the case. Certain of our abilities peak at very different ages. So, think about sprinters who win the Olympic races. These guys are 21 or 20. Think about people who win the Nobel Prize, also for math or physics, 20s and 30s. They might get it when they're in their 70s or 80s, but it's being given for work they did in their 20s. But on the other hand, chess grandmasters could be quite older. And the people who win in Scrabble, they're in their 70s, because there's some skills you can continue to build over the whole lifespan. And so we can't do a talk on aging until we show differences in brains. This is a normal brain. That's an Alzheimer's brain. You can see that there really is less going on neuronally or in the metabolism of these brains, and we have to worry about such things. And even from the simple public health point of view, one of the features of aging, one of the bad things, is an increased risk of all the chronic conditions that we would love to avoid. Hypertension, coronary artery disease, stroke, all increasing. The cancers, all increasing. These lead to increased prevalence of disability, already down from about 5% in the young people, and as high as 50% in people over age 75. So we really do have some worries, and we wouldn't worry about these things except that they translate into things that put us at risk of negative outcomes. And this is, for example, crashes per 100 million miles traveled. And you can see that the safe period of driving is here for people aged about 25 to about 75. But people over age 70 or 75 begin to look a lot like teenagers in their risk of crashing. Of course, they're not crashing for the same reasons, right? Older people do not typically drive while intoxicated, but their reaction times are slow and their judgment is impaired, and they look a little bit like young people who have crashes. So that's the big picture about aging. Just to give you a feel for how people in public health think about this stuff, we do surveys nationally, and we ask people, tell me about your health. Is it excellent, very good, or good, fair, or poor? And we also ask people, well, are you limited in your daily activities? Are you limited in work, let's say? Do you have trouble with household activities? Do you have trouble with bathing, dressing, and grooming, and personal care activities? And this is the picture of the United States population. If you cross-classify these by these, you get about 4 times 5 different health states. That's about 20 different health states. And most Americans are here. About 80% of them have no trouble with work, and their health is either excellent, very good, or good. And if you look at these cells down here, the poorer health and the disability, they're mostly empty. They're all less than 1%. Not a lot going on here. So what do you think would happen if we take this and do it again now, limiting it to just people over age 85? Well, I put it on the slide for you to see. This is what you get. Now you're seeing a migration down into this corner. A lot more disability, a lot more poorer health. If you add up the people who are not limited in excellent, very good, or good health, now it's only about 1/3 of the people aged 85 compared to 80% in the whole population. And that's the effect of aging on well-being. Another way to look at it is to take a group of people who are, let's say, 70, and we know the rate at which they die, we know the rate at which they begin to develop disabilities, and I did this for Europe in 2010. So at about age 72, I think I did it, 10% of the population had died, 1/3 was disabled, and about 60% were at that age with no disability. And what we want to do is change those proportions a little bit, especially move especially reduce this disabled component. And that would mean moving this curve up so it gets closer to this curve. And we public health people worry a lot about this. This is a way of picturing life expectancy. If we increase life expectancy, this red curve moves upward and to the right. And if the disability risk curve doesn't change any, that's not so good, because we've extended life without changing the risk of disability, and all we've done is increase the disabled years. We don't want to do that. We want to improve those. And so now let me return to my animals. I want to talk about this one, C. elegans. I once made the mistake of calling that worm a flatworm. It is actually a roundworm. And in a lecture something like this at West Virginia University, a man who was age 90 waited patiently until I had finished, asked if he could talk to me for a second, and then very gently and politely corrected me that it was not a flatworm, Dr. Albert, it's a roundworm, and you should know that. And he himself was a pathologist who knew all about this stuff. So forever now I know this is a roundworm. There's something very interesting about this roundworm. I'm not sure how well you can see this, so let me describe it. These roundworms die at about day 30. They have a very quick and short lifespan. So they're a very good model for looking at aging. And they enter old age at about day 12. Okay, that would be our equivalent of, let's say, 65, age 65. And these researchers did something very interesting. They came up with a phenotype of aging, which was how fast the worms move. And how do you know how fast a worm moves? Well, you put the worms at one end of a glass plate, and you put food at the other. And like every other species, guess what the worms do? They wiggle their way to the food. And you just time them, okay? And you could measure the amplitude of the wiggle if you like, but basically you could time them. And so these worms are either very fast or not so fast when they enter old age, and then they transition to slower and slower speeds in this particular measure. And something very interesting happens. You can't make out the colors so well, but you go from green to yellow to red in lockstep. The longer you stay green, the longer these worms are fast, the longer they live. And in every case, the transition is from fast to medium to slow to death. And it's kind of interesting, these are wild type worms. There's no genetic manipulation going on. Some of them enter old age with fast speeds, some of them enter old age slower. But on the whole, there's how fast you wiggle is related to when you die. And the interesting thing about this is just like humanity, except for one small fact. Okay, in what happens to the worms, they go from green to yellow to red. And what happens with people? They go from green to yellow, sometimes back to green. Or they go green to yellow to red and back to yellow. Or sometimes they go green, green, yellow, red, green. Because we have a public health system and we have physician care, unlike the worms. And it's very humbling to think that's probably the only really big difference between us and this humble organism that we look at so well. Let me give you another example of this. In a very famous study, a series of clinicians examined aging and how good your arteries looked. They measured the plaque in the abdominal aorta, very important blood vessel, not one you want to have an aneurysm in. Okay? And lo and behold, no surprise, the younger people were, the less plaque they had. Here's age. These are the young people. These are the middle-aged people. These are the old people. And this is the amount of plaque they have in their abdominal aorta. And that would not be very publishable in itself. We know this already. But what was interesting is the degree of overlap between this group and this group. Here's the variation in the middle-aged. Oops, excuse me. And here's the variation in the older age group. There's a group of older people here who look a lot like people in middle age when it comes to the amount of plaque in their arteries. That's an important finding. These people, while their chronologic age is in the 70s, actually have a biological age more like in the 50s. And this is what we call optimal aging. If you can look like these guys instead of these guys, you're doing something right. But what is it? How much of it is genetic? How much of it is behavioral? How much of it can we prevent? Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to speed up too because our time is short and it is a little hot up here. And I see some of you fanning yourself too. And tell you just about what we think, why we are optimistic about old age. We think it's going to be much better than it is and continues to improve. We know something from a very important study. It turns out that Union soldiers from our Civil War could qualify for pensions if they at age 60 if they were willing to undergo a medical exam. And our VA system did those medical exams for these Union soldiers in the year 1900 or so. Okay? And it turns out that the physician exam in 1900 isn't that different in some ways from what it is today. Of course, they didn't have the technologies we have now, but they had a stethoscope, and they looked for the same physical signs that physicians look for today. And I checked with a few physicians about this. They think it's true. They still take the stethoscope and check for decreased breath or adventitious sounds. That means congestion in the lungs. They still look, they were able to diagnose heart failure. They were able to look at back problems and joint problems and difficulty bending and difficulty walking. And this was the picture of men at age 60 to 74 in the year 1900. Now, where were these records? That's an interesting story. The guy who did this won the Nobel Prize for his work. He set a small army of graduate students to go to every VA facility in the United States, into the basement, and find these paper records, and then computerize them, and was able to get this picture of health in 1900, which we never had before. And then he compared it to men of the same age 100 years later, roughly. And these are the proportions of people with pulmonary problems or disabilities. And you can see that health is really better. Better to be old in 1990 than in 1900. And I would venture to say better to be old in 2010 or 2050 than in 1990. And we can expect to see improving health just this way. We know also that getting disabled just is not really the end of the story. So here's what people look like in the mid-80s, and here's what people look like 5 years later. And the only thing I want to mention here is certainly if you have no disability, 11% of these people died over 5 years. And if you have maximal disability, more like 40% died over 5 years. But the interesting story here is that many of the people with some disability here actually improved over the next 5 years. That's these groups here. I don't think I have time to go into it fully, but about 20% of these older people who would have been written off as disabled and on the slow, slippery slide to need for skilled care actually get better over time. So that gives us additional ideas that we can intervene more than we think.